Hello again. This is one of about 200 talks on the history of Western art, and they're divided into sections. This is section 61 on recent artists, episode 10 on Rachel Whiteread, who's a British artist best known for this work here, House. She produced in 1993, and another well-known work we'll see later is her Holocaust Memorial in Vienna, which is a squat, solid concrete building whose walls have the imprint of thousands of books. As always, let's start at the beginning. This is Rachel Whiteread standing in front of her first major work, Closet. Closet was made in 1988 when she was 25, and I admit I have combined the picture of Closet with a photograph of her from 2012. Closet is a cast of the interior of a wardrobe covered in black felt, and this piece set the stage for her later career and established her signature approach of preserving the unseen spaces within everyday objects. And this idea of solidifying the empty space, she called mummifying. The air itself is made solid, and the traces of humanity are left as marks on the absent surfaces. Also, she said for her, this particular work invoked childhood memories of hiding in closets. Talking about childhood, she was born in 1963 in Ilford, which is east of London, and she grew up in a creative household. Her mother, Patricia Whiteread, was an artist. Her father, Thomas, was a geography teacher, and this early exposure to art and an analytical approach to space and structures would later influence her sculptural practice. She first studied painting at Brighton Polytechnic, but she soon realised that she was more interested in sculpture, and she found it better suited to her fascination with physical objects and space. Then in 1985, she enrolled at the Slade School of Art in London, where she trained under the sculptor Philippa Barlow, and it was during this period that she started experimenting with casting, using plaster, concrete and resin to create sculptures that capture the negative space of objects. She first rose to prominence in 1990 with this work, Ghost. It's a concrete cast of a room in a Victorian terraced house, and at art school you were taught that negative spaces between objects are as important, if not more important, than the objects in themselves, because it's the negative spaces. By looking at the negative spaces, you can better define the objects in space. And if you don't focus on the negative spaces, if you don't construct them correctly, the objects tend to float and look ungrounded. And this work, Ghost, is the negative space of a room, and it established her reputation as one of Britain's most innovative artists. This here is the Victorian living room, which she cast in plaster. You might wonder how she did it. This is here a photograph of Whiteread engaging in the manual labour required to cast and assemble the room. She had both personal and universal intentions in this work of art. It invokes nostalgia, loss, the passage of time. It recalled childhood memories of domestic spaces. She chose a Victorian house because Victorian houses are quintessentially part of Britain's architectural history, and they talk about a wider theme of the loss of heritage. At the time she made this, many homes, Victorian homes, were being demolished or transformed, so this is a reflection of the disappearing urban landscape. It was exhibited at the Chisenhall Gallery in London and later acquired by the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., which is where it is now. Politically, many have seen this work as a critique of housing policies in the UK. It was in the 1980s, the late 80s and the early 90s, that Margaret Thatcher introduced major housing reform, which led to significant social changes, particularly amongst working class communities. And by casting an ordinary home's interior, she's preserved a fragment of a vanishing world and highlighted the tension between permanence and impermanence. It's interesting that many people who see this work for the first time say they feel an almost supernatural effect. It's described by some as a sense of displacement. What they're looking at should be air, but it's now solid, so it feels alien. And a lot of people reach out to touch the surface, expecting the warmth of walls, but it's the cold, rough texture of plaster. Anecdotally, she has often spoken about the physical demands of creating these pieces. This piece involved pouring plaster into an actual room and carefully removing it, as you saw. It's intense, heavy manual labour. And also it requires some structural engineering knowledge. She was worried at one stage that the entire structure might collapse before it was completed. So it's a high risk approach as she learnt this technique. Now, Ghost was a critical success, and it paved the way for her most famous work, this work, House. Similar but more radical, and this is cast in concrete. It gained national, well, in fact, even international attention. It sparked debates about art, public space and demolition, as we'll see. With House, she became the first woman to win the Turner Prize in November 1993. It's a life-sized replica of the interior of a condemned terraced house in Bow in London's East End. It took 2 years to plan, and the way that it was made is that a team sprayed liquid concrete into the building's interior before the external walls were removed. It was completed on the 25th of October 1993 and demolished 11 weeks later on the 11th of January 1994. Incidentally, it also won an organisation called the K Foundation an award of £40,000 for the worst work of art of the year. Initially, she refused to accept the money, of course, but they threatened to burn the money unless it was accepted. So she accepted the money and gave it to charity. And in fact, a year later, K Foundation did burn £1 million. But moving on with Whiteread, these negative spaces draw our attention to the forgotten space around them within our everyday world, and it fixes them as public monuments. These spaces are the areas normally occupied by human beings, and so solidifying them, they're like symbols for our human presence, or if you like, the absence of human beings in these spaces draw our attention to the ever-present humans that were once there. It took 3 months to complete the concrete spraying and to create this work. Incidentally, it was the whole road was a set of Victorian terraced houses, and they were all demolished by Tower Hamlets, bar this one, and the area was turned into a park, as you can see. The house that was left, this one, was visited, well, in fact, thousands of people visited it every day. It got rave reviews from the critics. Unfortunately, the chairman of the council, the Tower Hamlets Council, someone called Eric Flounders, described it as a monstrosity and ordered it to be demolished a month later. Critics have described this work as one of the most extraordinary and imaginative public sculptures ever created in Britain in the 20th century. A couple of years later, in 1995, she unveiled this work, Untitled brackets 100 Spaces, and what it is it's casts made from resin. There's 100 resin casts of the voids found beneath chairs, arranged in this grid-like formation, and this is in the Devine Gallery at Tate, Britain. And so each cast is the negative space where a chair once stood, solidifying the emptiness into a tangible form. And she's used coloured resins to add this translucency, allowing light to pass through and creating a sort of spectrum of hues. She wants to make the invisible visible and give form to the unseen space that is part of our daily lives. And by casting the area underneath chairs, she's highlighting the absence of the human body and, in a sense, making us aware of the former presence through its absence. And of course, it's a continuation of this idea that we first saw in Closet and then Ghost and then House. And by this stage, she was gaining international recognition, partly because she'd won the Turner Prize and partly for this very innovative technique of casting and focusing on negative spaces. This is a different work by Whiteread. It's called Demolished. It's a series of 12 photographs in 3 rows. The top is Clapham Park Estate, Ambergate Court. The second is the same estate but a different court, Bakewell Court. And then the third row is Trowbridge Estate, all in the East End of London. These are actually not photographs. They were photographs, but she turned them into screen prints. And they are, as you can see, a series of prints running across of the buildings being demolished. And it continues this idea of the destruction of our heritage. She photographed each of the 3 separate demolitions as a series of 3 stages from a single spot. And in addition, she took a single photograph of the context. And they were taken between 1993 and 95. The artwork is dated 1996. She lived and still lives in East London. It's a poor area of London. And she was recording the destruction of people's homes just after the period known as Thatcher's Britain, a time of economic recession, and there was a wave of rioting caused by high unemployment and social discontent. They might remind you, some of these photographs might remind you of a war zone, but that is offset to some extent by the fact that she created screen prints which give a certain beauty to the images. And she's recording, in her words, something that is going to be completely forgotten, the detritus of our culture. So with these prints, she's creating a memorial to the past. By the way, she's not saying things shouldn't be demolished. All she is saying is they should be remembered. Now, with all of the young British artists, one wonders to what extent they're trying to change the world. And Whiteread is pragmatic. She's actually addressed this question. She said, "I don't think art changes the world in terms of stopping people dying of AIDS or of starvation or being homeless. But for an individual, it can enhance daily life, reflect our times, and in that sense, change the way you think and are." As I said, she'd become an internationally famous artist, and this work in 1998, Water Tower, is installed on a rooftop in New York. It's a translucent resin cast of a rooftop water tower, and it's her first public sculpture in the US. And the reason she chose a water tower is, walking around the city, she came to regard it as a quintessential symbol of New York City. And she wanted to highlight an often overlooked feature of the urban landscape. It's installed on a roof in an area of New York called Soho. And it's situated, as you can see, between two functional water towers. So it creates a sort of dialogue between the art and its environment. It's a translucent resin, so it interacts with the light and changes its appearance through the day and blends with the skyline. Incidentally, for those that don't know, New York, Soho is, well, in fact, stands for south of Houston Street. It's an area frequented by artists and their studios and galleries. This work is a commentary on urbanization, unnoticed infrastructure, and is elevating a mundane object to the status of art. So she's challenging us to acknowledge the hidden structures and systems that facilitate daily existence. She's described it as a jewel on the skyline of Manhattan, highlighting its ephemeral beauty and its ability to make viewers reconsider their surroundings. It did, like a lot of her works, it involved considerable technical challenges. It's some 12 foot high, 9 foot in diameter, so it's heavy but delicate, being made of resin, and it had to be very carefully hoisted onto the rooftop and secured to a steel support structure, as you can see here, a sturdy structure. So it required a lot of planning, and she had to work with engineers and an installation team to make sure it was safely installed. Once it had been installed, it received critical acclaim. It was described as an extremely beautiful object which changes colour with the sky, and also a very appropriate one, celebrating one of the most idiosyncratic and charming features of the New York skyline. We move on to a more sombre work, another of her best-known works. This is Holocaust Memorial (Nameless Library) in Judenplatz, Vienna, installed in the year 2000. It's a powerful and thought-provoking tribute to the 65,000 Austrian Jews who perished during the Holocaust. It was commissioned after a long-standing initiative from the Holocaust survivor Simon Wiesenthal, and its unveiling was a pivotal moment in both public art and historical remembrance. The installation was actually delayed 5 years by a combination of bureaucracy and political issues, but as I said, it was completed in 2000. It looks like, well, it is a squat building, like a bomb shelter, but if you look at it closely, you can just about make it out. The vertical lines, when you walk up to it, reveal themselves to be the backs, the inverted cast of bookshelves with thousands of books. The spines of the book are facing inwards, symbolising the loss of Jewish culture and the obliteration of knowledge. So it's called, as I said, Nameless Library, and it's a tribute to the millions of books that were destroyed during the Nazi regime. And the stark concrete form contrasts with the buildings around it. As you can see, the Baroque architecture around it. So there's this visual tension which is meant to provoke reflection on Austria's past complicity in the Holocaust. The closed double doors have no handle, suggesting a lost opportunity for escape and the impossibility of access, reinforcing the idea of exclusion and finality. Despite the initial controversy, many people found the work too abstract. It's become a meaningful site of remembrance, and its austere design invokes sombre reflection about the past. So it's a space for mourning and a reminder of the importance of remembrance. Incidentally, the platform on which it sits has the names of the concentration camps inscribed in it, although here they're covered in snow when I took this photograph. And I chose this photograph that I'd taken because I thought the bleakness of the snow was an appropriate addition to the grim grey concrete. This is Monument, and it's on what's called the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square, and the work is made of resin and sits on a granite base. This empty plinth was intended to have a statue of William IV on it, but funds ran out at the time, and it remained empty for 150 years. Its use was debated many times and many ideas were suggested, and it's become known as the fourth plinth. She created this work Monument for it, and it reflects on the idea of monuments and memorials. So rather than a traditional statue, what she's done is she's taken a cast of the plinth itself with resin and then inverted it and placed it on the plinth. So it's a sort of reflection of the empty plinth, drawing our attention to the process of memorialization. And instead of celebrating a person or an event, she's commemorating and making us think about the very idea of public memorials. What are they for? What are they doing? How do we choose the people that go on them or the events to be represented? It was incidentally controversial. The other plinths in Trafalgar Square have historical figures on them. This is just a blank, empty structure, of course, and she's drawing our attention to the social and political ideas of inclusion and exclusion. Whose histories do we memorialise? Why do we choose certain figures to place in public spaces? Some people liked its simplicity and its thought-provoking conceptual depth. Others found it unsettling and too abstract. And the work was on the plinth. It's not there any longer if you're going to London. It stood on the plinth for several months and it was eventually replaced by other artists' contribution. The opposition that she faced to this work from some members of the public and press who felt it was too vague and lacked any clarity. They were expecting some icon to be put there, but she throughout maintained her commitment to the idea of absence using the space not to glorify but to provoke thought. This is Untitled brackets room 101 in 2003, shown here in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And what it is it's a plaster cast, as you can see, of the interior of a room in BBC's broadcasting house called Room 101. And it gained notoriety as it became the inspiration for George Orwell's Room 101 in his novel 1984, where in the novel it is the space of ultimate fear and torture in what was called in the novel the Ministry of Love. And Orwell, who worked in the BBC during World War II, based his fictional room on this room in the BBC. Just a quote from the book. "You asked me once, what was in room 101? I told you that you knew the answer already. Everybody knows it. The thing that is in room 101 is the worst thing in the world." End quote. Such is in 1984, the society follows everybody, is aware of everybody, and everybody's worst nightmare is known to the party. And this everybody's nightmare is therefore the punishment that the party can threaten people with. In the book, the protagonist, Winston Smith, it's to be effectively his head eaten alive by rats. In effect, or in actuality, Room 101 in the BBC was a mundane office. And it's been turned into this sort of haunting relic by being cast in plaster, and every detail has been captured, the cracks, the textures, the imperfections, making the room both familiar and alien. It serves as a sort of meditation on institutional power and the way that physical spaces can reflect collective anxieties. It's a work that is significant, I think, because it reminds us of and reflects Orwell's dystopian vision of a totalitarian and surveillance society, themes that, of course, remain relevant today. A very different work, Embankment, 2005, and this is in the Turbine Hall of Tate Modern. And it's 14,000 translucent white polyethylene boxes. And it was on display in the Turbine Hall between October 2005 and May 2006. A monumental installation, as you can see. The boxes were casts of cardboard boxes, and they're stacked in irregular formations, giving us this sense of order and disorder. And it was inspired by Whiteread's personal memories when she was rummaging, sorting through her late mother's belongings. And in the attic, in the house of her late mother, were cardboard boxes full of her mother's belongings, and this caused her to meditate on memory and loss and the passage of time. And to capture that, she took a cast of the box and has replicated that over and over again, and then stacked them to create this vast immersive landscape. Like memory itself, it filled the massive turbine hall with these towering stacks and scattered clusters of box casts. You have, as you can see with the people here, you have to navigate your way through and around them, and the boxes themselves, being translucent, create interplay with light, making them look ghostly and ephemeral. She also said that when she was making this work, she was inspired by observing piles of snow during a trip to Scandinavia. So it was a combination of her thoughts and memories. These are dolls' houses. It's called Place (Village), and this was originally installed in the Foundling Museum and then moved, as you see here, to the Young V&A. It's a sculptural installation combining personal memory and social commentary. It's 150 vintage dolls' houses, and Whiteread collected them over 20 years, and she's arranged them, as you can see, in these stepped platforms to resemble a sort of sprawling hillside community, with each house lit from inside, but the whole place is devoid of inhabitants or furniture, so there's this eerie sense of absence and possibly melancholy. It was, as I said, first exhibited at the Foundling Museum, which was created in the 18th century to take in orphans, and the work reminds us of, or is a sort of repository of memory of domestic spaces. She collected the dolls' houses because she said she's always been interested in dolls' houses because they are objects passed down through generations, imbued with love and history, but eventually discarded, like the orphan babies often left outside of the Foundling Hospital because the mothers couldn't care for them. And the deserted nature of the houses in this work mirror this cycle of attachment and abandonment. And it conveys the Foundling Museum's focus on childhood and care. Incidentally, the work was difficult to create because the dolls' houses that she gathered, as I said, they were vintage dolls' houses. Some of them were so fragile that they arrived at her studio in pieces. So a lot of these dolls' houses were carefully restored by her and others. So the work underscores her commitment to preserving their history and then transforming them into a work of art. This is Detached 1, 2012. It's a cast of a garden shed. It's a continuation of her fascination with negative spaces and domestic architecture, reflecting her interest in memory, absence, and the structures of everyday life. She made 3 freestanding cast sheds rendered in solid concrete, but capturing the area inside the shed. They appear heavy and impenetrable, but of course they reflect the lost interior, like her cast work. All of her cast works have that paradox of being a cast of what was air, so something light and free turned into something heavy and impenetrable. It's both a comment on urban alienation, the fragility of personal space, the erosion of traditional working class environments. Sheds, of course, particularly in the UK, are found in most gardens associated with hobbies and storage and retreats. So they're tomb-like retreats, which in her hands have been turned into monuments of past lives. This is US Embassy Windows 2015, and it's a series of casts of windows incorporated in the design of the new US Embassy in London. The at the top left, you can just see the corner of the embassy itself. It's a contribution to it was commissioned, it's a contribution to the architectural design of the US Embassy. It's not a standalone sculpture, it's integrated into the building, and it's hung on the wall, the entrance lobby. It's a series of window panels that have been cast and embedded into this concrete structure, which is now on the wall of the embassy. The windows appear sort of ghostly and frozen in time because they're capturing the voids of what would otherwise be a transparent window looking out onto something. Now it's closed. It reflects diplomacy, surveillance, security, and it could be interpreted as a reflection on the nature of political space. Embassies, of course, are bridges between nations and fortresses. So the windows suggest openness, but ultimately they're solid. So there's this paradox. The embassies are both a site of welcoming people, but also keeping out unwelcome people, restrictions and security. Although it does look like concrete, the windows are cast in resin, and windows became a recurring motif in her work. It symbolises international relations, and she's making familiar shapes, windows, strange, and encouraging our reflection on the barriers, both literal and metaphorical, that shape our world. It was commissioned by the US State Department in their embassy program, and it's casts of sections of the windows of typical 1950s American suburban houses. Another work in the US, this is on Governor's Island, New York. It's called Cabin, and it's a meditative work. It's an isolated work. It's site-specific. It's on somewhere called Discovery Hill on Governor's Island, and it's a permanent public artwork. It's concrete cast of a New England style wooden shed, reflecting again her fascination with domestic spaces. It's modest and isolated, and it reflects themes of solitude and reflection and our connection with nature. It's inspired by Henry David Thoreau Walden's seminal text on simple living and self-reliance, and she saw Cabin as a space for contemplation. So it's to encourage visitors to pause and reflect amidst the bustling cityscape of New York. It's up on a hill, as you can see. It's got sweeping views. You can't see here, but I think it's just to the left of this picture of the Statue of Liberty and Manhattan. So it's a tranquil, natural setting overlooking an area of urban density. Again, a traditional practice of casting negative spaces in 2016 when she produced this work. It's a commentary on isolation and retreat in an era of global connectivity. It's some people who visit the island mistake it for a shed, an actual shed, and or a historic relic rather than a contemporary artwork. And in a way, I think that would please Whiteread because it blurs the boundary between art and everyday life. Which brings us on to the final work I wanted to show you, Internal Objects 2022. This is situated in the Gagosian Gallery, and you can see it's not a cast in the way that she normally does it. She's changed direction, and she produced a series of sculptures featuring abandoned structures, in this case a dilapidated shed constructed from found materials like wood, metal and plaster. She's not taken a cast of the negative spaces. This is a positive form that evokes a sense of decay and abandonment. Its interior is exposed, the weathered exterior, and again it's inviting viewers to contemplate memory, loss and the passage of time. And it's a commentary on urban decay and neglect. It's a sort of a structure discarded by society, and she's drawing our attention to often overlooked spaces and buildings in our environment. What she calls ghosts of internal objects, which she feels embody the memories and experience associated with these once used but now neglected structures. She created this during COVID-19 lockdown, so it does reflect isolation and restrictions of the period, and partly it led her to the necessity to work more intimately with the material she had on hand, because she wasn't free to travel and create works in the way that she'd formerly done. But it does also show that she can and has evolved, demonstrating her ability to rise to a new challenge and establish a new artistic language for herself. So that brings me to the end of this short survey of her work. So what have we learned about her? Her use of negative spaces suggests a mind that's drawn to hidden aspects of everyday life, reflective and introspective nature. Her reinvention of traditional casting techniques shows she is creative and will push conventional limits. She uses everyday objects which are imbued with a sort of emotional power, and it's clear that she's a profoundly emotional person herself. But of course, as the first woman to win the Turner Prize, she's also resilient, hardworking and determined. And I think the Holocaust Memorial shows us her social and political consciousness and her search for new ways to see the world, which means that she's also intellectually curious. She's a deeply thoughtful, innovative, emotionally attuned, socially conscious, resilient and intellectually curious person, and that it's these traits that contribute to her unique artistic tradition and successful career. So that brings me to the end of my talk today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you again for your time and attention, and I look forward to recording many more talks for you. Goodbye for now.